All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us virtually tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Jeffrey Toobin, presenting his new book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors, The Investigation of Donald Trump. He'll be in conversation with NOAH FELDMAN. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. After the introduction, I'll drop a link to the chat to purchase True Crimes and Misdemeanors. Your purchases and financial contributions, I'll also share a link to donate, make this virtual event series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in our virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Jeffrey Toobin is a staff writer at The New Yorker, as well as the chief legal analyst at CNN, where you may have even seen him earlier tonight. He's the author of several bestsellers, including American Heiress, The Oath, The Nine, and The Run of His Life, which was the basis for the American crime story, The People versus O.J. Simpson on FX. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he's no stranger to Cambridge, graduating from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he was the editor of the Law Review. He'll be joined in conversation tonight by NOAH FELDMAN. NOAH is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, where he specializes in constitutional studies. In 2003, he served as Senior Constitutional Advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and he's the author of 8 books. They'll be discussing Jeff's new book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors, a legal thriller that dives into the Mueller investigation, the impeachment of President Trump, and why he got away with it. In the New York Times book review, Katie Benner writes, Toobin's absorbing, fast-paced narrative is anchored by detailed scenes of chaos inside the Trump administration and meetings between Trump's and Mueller's lawyers. If he is right, then True Crimes and Misdemeanors stands as a chilling preview of what to expect should Trump win a second term, and also as a roadmap for all that needs repair should he lose. And now I'm so pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. The digital podium is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to begin, this is Noah, I just want to begin by congratulating Jeff on an extraordinary book that, you all know the adage that journalism at its best produces the first draft of history. This is a first draft of history, but it's not just a first draft, it's also a second draft, because not only does it uncover remarkable sources, it also works with existing documents. In some sense, the Mueller report itself was the first draft of history, so this is the second draft. And this is a book that's going to have a major, major impact for many decades on not only our, but future generations' reception of what the hell just happened to our country over the last 2 years. So first off, I just want to congratulate Jeff. Jeff, I want to just start by asking you, this is a thriller, it's a page turner. Is it also a tragedy?
You know, first of all, in the best political tradition, I'm going to begin by not answering your question and just say how thrilled I am to participate in an event for Harvard Bookstore, which I have loved for many, many years. I spent most of my college career not doing my schoolwork, but at the Harvard Crimson, which is literally on the same block as Harvard Bookstore. And it's a place I have visited and bought books for many, many years. And I'm delighted to offer my words of support and to support it through this event and any other way I can. Now, to answer your question, Noah, I think that is exactly a good way to describe the book, because I begin the book with a set piece, the one and only meeting between Donald Trump and Robert Mueller, the only time they have ever met in person. And I contrast their characters there, and I talk about their backgrounds, which are surprisingly more similar than you may think. Both of them are pre-baby boomers. They are born during World War II, both of them. Mueller's just 2 years older. Both raised in wealth. Mueller's father was an executive at DuPont. Both Ivy League educated. Mueller at Princeton, Trump at Penn. But almost immediately, their lives took dramatically different directions under the crucible of their generation, which was Vietnam. As I think most people know, Donald Trump dodged the draft and came up with this fictitious bone spurs that got him out of service. Robert Mueller didn't just serve in Vietnam, but he wanted to enlist in the Marines so badly that he waited 2 years for a knee injury to recover, and then enlisted in the Marines and served with distinction in Vietnam. What followed was a career dedicated to the preservation of American institutions, whether it was the Marine Corps, the FBI, or the Justice Department. He has always been a person who is about these institutions rather than himself, whereas Donald Trump has been only about himself. But the story of the book, at least the first 2/3 of it, is really about the story of how Trump won and Mueller lost. And at one point I say to compare their characters is to test the conventions of journalistic balance, because they are so different, and Trump is so much worse a human being than Mueller is, that there is an element of tragedy to the fact that, at least in their confrontation, it was Trump who emerged on top. But frankly, that's one of the reasons, Noah, I like writing books, is because things are complicated, and it's the good guys don't always win, and events take off in unpredictable ways. But I do think that tragedy is one good description of what happened.
Jeff, one of your subspecialties is that you like writing investigative books about institutions that don't leak. So you did a book about the Supreme Court over the Bush v. Gore era, where you got an institution that famously, at least until the last 6 or 8 months, does not leak, and you got all kinds of fascinating pieces of information. The Mueller team, similarly, during the investigations, at least, was notorious or praiseworthy, depending on how you think of it, for not leaking, for maintaining a Mueller-like consistency and silence. So how did you go about open the curtain a little bit for viewers about how someone like you, who knows many of the players, who's deeply connected in the legal world, has social and professional and other relationships with people, how do you go about trying to glean information in these situations?
Well, this was, it's interesting. We've both written 8 books. This was the hardest book I've written, and the most unnerving, for just the reason you described. Because when I agreed to write this book, more or less as soon as Mueller was appointed in May of 2017, and I thought, oh well, I'll start to report. Well, I quickly discovered, as most journalists, as all journalists in Washington discovered, there was nothing to get from Mueller's office. They simply did not. They didn't just not leak. They didn't meet with reporters off the record. They didn't chat. They didn't offer hints. There was nothing, and it was deeply unnerving to me, in a perverse way, kind of praiseworthy to see an institution, albeit a small one, that functioned this way. So for the period of the Mueller investigation, I had to work around them. But the good news about that was the Mueller office, as buttoned up as it was they dealt with people. They had witnesses, they had defense lawyers, they had other people who had interactions with them. So I concentrated my reporting on those people who were more accessible to me. And I counted on the fact that when Mueller shut down, I would get access, and that turned out to be the case. And I'm deeply grateful to the people who spoke to me, and I did get access to Mueller's people after the office closed up shop. But as I say, it was very unnerving not to have that access, for a period of that was 2 years, two plus years. The other thing about this book that was so distinctive, at least in my history, was how the story evolved. I mean, remember, in 2017, not only did I not know how the Mueller investigation was going to end up, I, of course, had no idea that the Ukraine investigation was going to be layered on top of it. And I determined, I think rightly, that you couldn't tell one without the other. And one of the things, frankly, I'm proudest of in the book is my effort to show that Russia and Ukraine are far more one investigation than two. That the ties both between the cast of characters, the behavior of the president, is much more a single story than two stories. That was a congressional investigation, and Congress is a somewhat easier nut to crack than certainly Mueller's office. But you're right; it was a considerable challenge to do the kind of reporting I like to do with the Mueller office organized the way it was.
In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you some deep down dive questions about, what strike me as the most fascinating and troubling aspects of what happened. But first, I just want to ask you to give us a little sense of personalities and color, because from the perspective, again, of even the news junkie, which I am, it was very hard to get a sense of who were the personalities, including Mueller's personality, within his team, what they were like, and how that went into the way they were doing the investigation. Mueller was, and I think, to be fair, it comes through from your book a little bit, as almost too good to be true. This guy actually is, by your account, the sincere, genuine, apolitical Marine who loves his country. So say more about his personality and about the personalities of others.
Well, he and I think you are right that he is what he appears to be. In keeping with the theme of tragedy, which you raised at the beginning, there is also in Mueller, and we can explore this, his greatest attributes are also perhaps his greatest flaws. That his diligence, his commitment to institutions, his Boy Scout earnestness is, I think, may not have been precisely the set of skills that this situation called for. I don't want to give the impression that either that I think the Mueller investigation was a wall-to-wall failure. I don't want to give that impression, because I don't think it was. I think there were a lot of successes, whether it was the prosecution of Michael Flynn or Paul Manafort or Rick Gates or Roger Stone, or the portions of the report that laid out in really extraordinary detail just how extensive the Russian effort to influence the 2016 election really was. I mean, it's an extraordinary. It is an extraordinary document, and was brilliantly researched in a very limited period of time. In terms of Mueller's staff, I think there was a misimpression fed by Rudolph Giuliani and the president himself that the most important thing to know about their staff was that many of them had given money to Democratic candidates, including Hillary Clinton. That's true. And you can see why that was an unnerving and unhappy fact for Trump and his supporters. However, I think the most important fact about Mueller's staff was that they were all either career or long-term prosecutors, that they had the key professional experience of their lives, even if they had since moved into law firms, is that they had worked as prosecutors. And I mean, here's where I think my own brief career as a prosecutor was of some value, in that prosecutors, have a very specific idea of their own role, which is to identify and prosecute crimes, but that's it. They do not see their roles as political actors. They do not see their roles as avenging angels for people they don't like. They have a very specific function in our governmental structure, and I think they were conservative in this, not in the left-right political sense, but conservative in the sense that they did not go beyond the charter that Rod Rosenstein assigned them at the very beginning. And I think that turned out to be a source of frustration to a lot of people who invested undue hope in the Mueller investigation. But for the most part, they really were focused on what crimes we could identify and prove.
Let's turn now to what is in some way the kind of shocking climax / anticlimax of the book that you write about pretty extensively. And that is the decision by Mueller, and in your depiction, it sounds like it was made by Mueller himself, and I want to hear more about this, that in the report, they would lay out, when it came to President Trump, they would lay out the law that lays out these are the elements of a criminal offense. They would then go through the conduct that they believed it could be shown the president had committed, in several instances, 4 or 5 instances, meeting all of the elements of that criminal offense. And then the report omitted the conclusion that I teach my law students to write and that all lawyers are taught to do. You state the issue, they did that. You state the rule, they did that. You apply the rule to the facts, they did that. And then we teach, then you write the conclusion, they didn't do that. They left out the conclusion that says, and therefore, almost a formulaic conclusion in a legal document, and therefore, in the light of this, the conduct committed by President Trump constitutes a criminal offense. They chose not to do that. I'm obsessed with, fascinated by, you name it, about this decision, which seems to me to have been wildly consequential. And I want to hear what you think about what happened, why it happened, and what your research revealed about it, because you talk really interestingly about it in the book, but I think you also talk about it delicately.
Okay, let me just give you, Mueller himself, or the office itself in the report explains their stated reason anyway for why they didn't offer a conclusion on the issue of obstruction of justice. They said that under Department of Justice policy, which I think a lot of people became familiar with, established in the Watergate era and reaffirmed when Bill Clinton was president, the Justice Department policy is that no sitting president can be indicted, that under our separation of powers, it is simply inappropriate and unduly risky to force the president of the United States to defend against a criminal case while he is president of the United States. I happen to think that's correct. I think it's the appropriate policy. But Mueller, who was, and again, I don't want to get on a tangent here too much, but Mueller was not an independent counsel. He was a special counsel. The independent counsels, Kenneth Starr, Lawrence Walsh, and a few others, they were appointed by a set of judges under the Ethics in Government Act, and they had an independent legal basis on which to conduct their investigations. Mueller, that law had expired by the time Mueller was appointed, and he was appointed by the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and was always, as everyone acknowledged, including Mueller, a subordinate in the Justice Department, bound by Justice Department policy. So he felt, I think correctly, that he did not have the authority to indict Donald Trump. However, what he did was go a step further. He said, and it's spelled out in the report, he says, because I do not have the right under Justice Department policy to issue an indictment of the president, that means the president would not have the right to have his day in court and respond to such a charge. In light of that, it would be unfair to say that he is guilty of such a crime because he has no forum in which to respond to it. This, to me, was a disastrous miscalculation, but I think is indicative of the sort of rule-bound, institution-respecting view that Mueller brought to this and every aspect of his life. He thought that he did not want to go outside his charter. I thought this was wrong for two reasons. One was there was just no such requirement. I think he was, unduly cautious and almost actively misleading people about what he found. And the shame of that is the obstruction of justice investigation was really brilliantly conducted by Mueller and his staff. I mean, they assembled a very powerful case, and that made it especially sad and tragic even that they didn't, have the courage of their convictions to say what the evidence shows. But it was tragic for another reason, and this, I think, reflects Mueller's naivete, perhaps is the right word, about the political world in which he was living. By not announcing that conclusion, a conclusion that was all but mandated by what he had found, he left it up to his superiors in the Department of Justice to make their own conclusions. And by the time the report came out, his supervisor was no longer Rod Rosenstein, but the new Attorney General, William Barr. And what Mueller didn't realize or chose not to acknowledge was that William Barr had turned into the most egregious kind of political partisan, the most transparent defender of Trump's behavior, notwithstanding the law and the facts and ethics. And by not announcing his own conclusion, he served up the opportunity to Barr to announce his conclusion, which he did on that famous Sunday afternoon news conference in March of 2019, followed by a month of silence in which Mueller thought at least his general conclusions would be released. They were not. And Barr allowed the conventional wisdom to congeal that Mueller essentially found nothing. That deference to the Attorney General was, I think, a tragic example of Mueller's institutionalism, as was his failure to fight back in any sort of meaningful way to what Barr said.
When these events happen in real life, when I read that passage in the Mueller report the day it came out, I thought to myself, well, maybe Mueller believes this, although I had trouble even accepting that. You've convinced me that Mueller did believe this.
Oh, yeah.
But then I thought to myself, the people I know on his team can't possibly have been okay with this. So then when your book came out, the very first thing I did is I flipped to the page, where you talked about it. And it turned out there were 3 or 4 instances where you talked about this decision in the hopes that you would have uncovered some daylight between Mueller and some members of his team about this decision. But if you did, you didn't put it in the book, so I'm guessing you didn't uncover anything.
I mean, this was an enormously cohesive group and enormously dedicated to Mueller personally. I mean, he is someone that throughout his career has generated enormous gratitude, respect, admiration from the people around him. And that is true for the people who work for him in the special counsel's office as well. It is true that there were kind of hawks and doves within the office. There were team leaders in the way the office was structured is that there were teams. Understandably, and there was like a Russia team and a lawyer in Washington named Jeannie Rhee a former prosecutor, later a law firm partner of Mueller's at the Wilmer-Hale firm. She was the head of the Russia team. And Andrew Weissman, who was an assistant U.S. attorney in Brooklyn. We were colleagues there in that office. Someone with a reputation for extremely aggressive action. He was the head of the Manafort team. Andrew Goldstein, a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, Manhattan, as well as one of Mueller's partners from the Wilmer-Hale firm, were in charge of the White House, the obstruction of justice investigation. Jim Quarles was the name of that lawyer. Jeannie Rhee and Andrew Weissman were kind of the firebrands of the office. They were the more aggressive prosecutors. Quarles and Goldstein were somewhat less aggressive, and they were, part of the White House team. I think that was, and I make somewhat of an allusion to that in the office, but I don't want to give you the impression that there was some kind of dramatic split in the office and people protesting and all that. That was not the way things went. Though I think in their heart of hearts there are people in that office who wished Mueller had been more aggressive, particularly in the conclusion of the report that we're discussing.
When Mueller testified in, I guess, July of 2019, a little more than a year ago, lots of people listening in, myself included, were concerned that this was not the Mueller that they had most recently heard in public, and that he had lost a step or maybe a step and a half. What's your assessment of that testimony, but more fundamentally, of whether that impression was in any way accurate?
I think it was accurate. Mueller, Mueller was 72 when he took the job as special counsel, and 74 when he gave that testimony. It aged him. It was an enormous amount of pressure. It was a grind that was, involved a great deal of time, but also just stress, even though he was not speaking in public during that time. And 74-year-olds vary in their vigor. There were also quirky, weird things that went on that day, July 24th, 2019. There was this. The Democrats had just retaken control of the House Judiciary Committee, and one thing that had not been sorted out was the rules for how photographers could sit in the well of the hearing room and take photographs, and they wound up being there in enormous numbers for the entire period of Mueller's testimony, loudly clicking their photographs. And Mueller, an older man, but also just any kind of person, it was very loud and distracting to have all these photographers in front of him. The questioners also went out of order, so it wasn't clear, who was going to ask the next question. So I do think he was a diminished figure. He was also someone who desperately did not want to testify. I can't say that he didn't want to testify because of his physical diminishment. I don't have that much access to his inner psyche, but he is someone who comes out of a tradition that prosecutors say their piece in courtrooms or not at all. He also knew that Democrats wanted to use Mueller's testimony as a vehicle to rejuvenate a movement for impeachment that was floundering at that point. So you had a situation where he didn't want to be there, he couldn't hear the questions, he was a diminished figure, and it was, I think, a really unfortunate and even embarrassing touchstone and punctuation mark on his really distinguished public career.
Let me ask you a counterfactual, Jeff, that's plagued me. So, there were 2 volumes to the Mueller report, and as you mentioned, the second volume, the volume that focused on obstruction of justice, presented substantial evidence of criminal acts by the president. The first volume, though, the volume about Russia, certainly showed, as subsequent prosecutions also showed, serious and concerted Russian intelligence-driven efforts to influence the 2016 election. But it did not find, or to be more precise, it said that it did not find evidence of, or convincing evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign, or coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russians. I have always wondered what Mueller would have done had he found that in the first volume. You know, I have wondered if he found that in the first volume, would he then have been prepared to say, and this constitutes a criminal act by the president? I have always wondered if the fact that they couldn't find collusion then made Mueller a little bit nervous about focusing on the criminal acts in the second volume of obstruction of justice, which after all were mostly obstruction that arose out of his investigation.
Oh,
so you were mentioning that Mueller is the kind of prosecutor who doesn't want to make it about himself, also the kind of man who doesn't want to make it about himself, sort of the anti-Trump in that way. And it would have been about him. It would have been essentially, you know, they, for example, they would have been saying that the president committed an obstruction of justice crime by directing people in his administration to fire Mueller himself.
Right.
So do you think that the fact that they didn't find collusion mattered in the end?
Well, I mean, I think, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. I do think that if Mueller had found, you know, a genuine participation in the Russian effort to influence this election by either Trump himself or people in his campaign, he would have prosecuted it. I mean, one of the unfortunate aspects of the Mueller investigation, and in a way unfair, is that he has not gotten enough credit, and this was Jeannie Rhee's investigation, in uncovering the magnitude of the effort that the Russians undertook to get Donald Trump elected. There were two main parts of it. One was the social media campaign run out of this sort of quasi-private company called the Internet Research Agency, run by one of Putin's closest oligarchs in St. Petersburg, that you know, used social media to help Trump get elected. I mean, I don't think that turned the outcome of the election. It was relatively small potatoes compared to the other part of the effort, which was the hacking, which was the Russian government itself, Russian military intelligence, you know, hacked the Democratic National Committee emails and John Podesta, Clinton campaign chair's emails, turned them over to WikiLeaks, which released them to devastating effect. I mean, really big impact on the election. If Mueller had found that the president had knowingly joined that effort, I do think he would have brought a prosecution. The irony is, all the evidence suggested that the president wanted to join that conspiracy, was delighted that the conspiracy was going on. There's a wonderful moment in this investigation, which I talk about in this book, where a young prosecutor on Mueller's staff named Rush Atkinson, he's going over the hacking, and he sees one day in July of 2016 that the hacking just sort of spikes. You know, there's more hacking that goes on, and he's like, well, like, why that day? What's going on that day? And so he starts Googling around, and he sees that is the day that Trump has his news conference at Mar-a-Lago and says, Russia, if you're listening, go get Hillary Clinton's emails. And he and Jeannie Rhee, who's his boss, like, they start looking at this and they think, well, could it really be like a call and response? And they start looking at the possibilities of the time zone and when Trump said it and when it could be heard in Russia. And they do show that it does appear Russia heard Trump say that and then ramped up its hacking. But as a criminal matter, you know, under the law of conspiracy, you have to have a meeting of the minds. You have to have some sort of agreement between the two parties. And that doesn't show an agreement. It simply shows one person saying something and another person responding to it. But it shows just how close the nexus was between the Trump campaign and Russia. One of the things that came out in the Senate Intelligence Committee report that was just released, I guess it was yesterday, it's something that's an elaboration on something Mueller talks about, which is this fellow Konstantin Kilimnik, who had worked closely with Manafort on its efforts on behalf of the pro-Russian party in Ukraine. And he was meeting with him throughout his tenure as Trump's campaign chair and feeding him information that the Senate Intelligence Committee says was essentially Kilimnik was essentially a Russian intelligence agent. Again, something closer to actual collusion, but not something that Mueller had the goods to prove.
Just to ask you one more question about this before I turn to audience questions. If you take off for a second your careful reporter hat, the hat that says, I cannot report anything that isn't, validated by multiple sources, and you ask yourself, do you think that there was collusion and they just couldn't pin it down? I mean, they came very close in the instance that you mentioned. They also came very close with Roger Stone, whose communications via the WikiLeaks people got us very close to coordination, but in the end, not quite close enough. Do you think that they didn't find it because it wasn't there? Or do you think that they just couldn't get that last step of the investigation?
And you might add the infamous June 2016 meeting
Yes.
at Trump Tower, set up by the email that says, this is part of the Russian government's help to get your father elected, which the PR guy Rob Goldstone sends to Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort. I think it wasn't there. I think there was not the kind of collusion that either in a colloquial sense or in a legal sense that you could prove. What you could see was that Trump was willing to do it. And here's why. I mean, he had no scruples about obtaining assistance from a foreign power to get himself elected, which in and of itself is illegal. But he didn't have the access or the wherewithal actually to make that connection. I think Roger Stone, to use a technical legal term, is a bullshit artist. I don't think he really had he wanted contacts with Russia, but never really got them. But I think in a way, the proof of what Trump wanted out of Russia was what he did with Ukraine. Is that he didn't in 2016 really have anything to offer a foreign power. He was a long shot candidate for president. He couldn't give Vladimir Putin anything. He had no leverage at that point. In 2019, when he starts dealing with the new president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, he shows that he is more than willing to use a foreign power for his personal political gain, and does so both in the infamous July 25th phone call and in the whole course of conduct leading up to that. That shows that Trump was willing to do it, but I don't think it actually happened during the 2016 campaign.
Jeff, your reference to the July 25th call takes us to the subsequent impeachment process, which, of course, was not based on the Mueller report, but was based on the Ukraine Act, which is you also cover in the book, in which you say, I think correctly, need to be understood in context with each other. And actually, the first question that we have is directly about that. And the question is this one. This is from Michelle Martinez. Was it a mistake for the Democrats not to bring the formal charge of either bribery or extortion against Trump as part of the articles of impeachment? And I'm glad you're going to answer that, not me, because I was involved in testifying on exactly that subject.
On exactly that, and this to me was a totally fascinating aspect of the the impeachment debate, which was, why do it's like, what did he do wrong? Like, what everybody knew at some level that this phone call and the surrounding behavior was wrong, but what was wrong with it? And there was a great temptation on the part of many people on the Democratic side in the House of Representatives to the constitutional phrase is treason. An impeachable offense is treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Bribery was this. What was Trump bribing President Zelensky? I will give you this money, this congressionally appropriated military assistance in return for this dirt on Joe Biden. Was that a kind of bribe? It's tempting because it was mentioned in the Constitution. I don't think it was. And it would have bogged them down in technical discussions of the law of bribery, which has changed a lot in recent years. Was it extortion? Not really, I don't think. What it was an abuse of power. And if you look at the history of the impeachment clause in the Constitution, if you look at sort of what impeachment really means, it's about presidents abusing their power. And I thought they characterized the president's behavior correctly, because I didn't think it was bribery. I didn't think it was treason. But in a way, it was worse than a crime. Because, Noah, you and I can commit bribe. We can pay a bribe. We can extort somebody. But you and I can't abuse the powers of the presidency. Only the president can do that. And I thought in that respect, it was more serious than a garden variety crime. But since you testified and you were in the book, what do you think about that question?
Well, I think exactly what you said. I mean, I said it under oath, so I definitely have to believe it. I think that the high crime and misdemeanor of abuse of power is the one that the framers were most worried about, because abuse of power is how the president uses the fact that he is president to break the election process and remain president. And that's literally what they were talking about in Philadelphia in 1787. That's why they put impeachment in the Constitution in the first place. They had a whole debate about taking it out because of its potential abuse. And then what convinced the skeptics to leave it in was the possibility that the president would use his power to distort the election process. So yeah, I mean, it's worse because it undercuts the very foundation of democracy itself. So yeah, I think it's
I was convinced by your testimony, and I thought
you and you alone.
No, that's not true. And I thought the committee did the right thing. There is a lot of after the fact criticism. It certainly is a big issue. There's plenty of reason for criticism. It's like, if only they had phrased it this way, or if only they had included another count about either obstruction of justice or a violation of the Emoluments Clause.
Wasn't going to make
there
any
was
difference.
No way there would
make
be 67 votes to remove Donald Trump from office
under
any circumstances. So it's not like this is sort of if only situation. But you could still be right or wrong. But I happen to think that was a correct decision that they made.
The next two questions are actually from opposite sides of the fence about the Trump to stone to WikiLeaks issue. One says that Ellen Ratner, the sometime Fox journalist, says in an interview, I actually don't know if this is the case, but I have no reason to doubt it, that she says in an interview that let's see, that I'm losing my question. Sorry, it's just sliding because someone else asked a question, and so my screen moved. That Ratner says that Assange told her, Julian Assange told her, that the Russians did not leak the emails, did not steal the emails, but they came from an inside source in the Democratic Party. So that question is, doesn't this undercut the whole collusion narrative? Then from the other side, the question is whether the newly released Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out yesterday, whether that confirms that Trump did conspire with Russian operatives through Stone to get assistance. So those are questions from both sides.
Okay, well, the first question is, the idea that these were leaked by someone in the Democratic Party, has been scientifically refuted. I mean, if you read this section of the Mueller report, and it is borne out by the Senate Intelligence Committee report, that this was a hacking operation by the Russian military intelligence operation. They followed the keystrokes of the participants in the conspiracy to do this. There is just no way these emails were leaked by someone inside, or this truly insane and sinister, murder mystery conspiracy that, the poor Seth, the guy who was killed in Washington had anything to do with it. It is beyond doubt, as far as I am concerned, that the Russians hacked both the DNC and John Podesta. So I don't. Now, as for the disclosures in the Senate Intelligence Committee report, for my sins, I have covered Roger Stone for many years, and I have to say, a part of me has appreciated him as a kind of rogue, character who I've enjoyed.
Best dressed criminal in my book.
Sorry?
He's the best dressed criminal in my book.
Best dressed criminal. He's got a big tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back, and how can you not like that? But if you look at the kind of thing that Stone liked to talk about with Trump over the years, it is this kind of sinister conspiratorial behavior and dirt about people. And there is a surface plausibility, more than a surface plausibility, that Stone would have told Trump about the WikiLeaks operation. But if you look at, as the Mueller office did, all of Stone's emails and text, he was trying to get that information from WikiLeaks, but as far as I could tell, he never did. And as for the contacts between Stone and Trump, they are either both lying, which is certainly possible, about not having discussed it. But, I am enough of a journalist and a former prosecutor to think that, well, then you just can't prove it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, if they're both lying, well, too bad. I mean, there are no emails, there are no tapes. I mean, that's just sort of, you can't bring a case on the grounds that, oh, come on, they must have discussed it. That's just not how the law works.
Yeah. Very interesting question by Allison Bayer. She asks, before Barr co-opted the narrative of the Mueller report, what do you think Mueller expected would be the next steps of the legislature, or maybe even the prosecutors in the future, given his findings? Did he think there would be an impeachment? Did he think there would be some change in the executive branch behavior? What was he picturing?
That's a great question, because I think I know Mueller would have said, that's not my job. It is not my job to initiate an impeachment investigation. It is not my job to make sure Donald Trump doesn't get reelected. My job is to present my findings to the Attorney General. That's what I was assigned to do. However, the one area where I think he was deeply disappointed and angry, although not angry enough to speak out, was that there had been the way the Mueller report was written. There were two parts, the Russia part and the obstruction of justice part, and there were sort of 10-page summaries at the beginning of each of those report, each part, and Mueller's subordinates, led by his sort of second in command, Aaron Zebley, had conversations with the Justice Department where Zebley and Mueller assumed that they had an agreement that Barr would release those summaries. And I think Mueller definitely had the expectation that because those summaries would be released immediately, his report would be accurately summarized to the public. What Mueller didn't anticipate and was frustrated by, although not frustrated enough to really speak out about it, was that Barr would not release those summaries, but would instead put his own gloss on it and mislead the public about what he found. And I think that was a source of it was certainly a source of anger to Mueller's staff, but Mueller, being the institutionalist that he is, acted like the Attorney General's subordinate that he was and didn't put up the fight that I think he should have about the distortion of his report.
Two people have questions about what happens if Trump loses the election. One, do you think he'll be prosecuted for a federal or maybe a New York State crime when he leaves office? Another about Barr. Is Barr at any risk of criminal prosecution? Should he be put out of office?
Well, let me just, Barr, no. I think William Barr has been a bad Attorney General, but I don't think there is any basis for any sort of criminal prosecution of him. Trump's a different story, and I think it's a very different story given the two jurisdictions you're talking about. I don't think there is any chance that the United States Department of Justice under Joseph Biden and Biden's designee as Attorney General, whoever it will turn out to be.
Elizabeth Warren, you heard it here first.
Elizabeth, I thought she was going to be Secretary of the Treasury.
I don't think I think the markets would crash, and I think even Joe Biden.
Well, anyway, it's whoever it turns out to be. I don't think there will be any federal prosecution of Donald Trump. If it were to happen, if the Department of Justice were to bring a case against Donald Trump, that would suck all the oxygen out of Washington for the foreseeable future. And the Biden presidency would rest on the success of the prosecution of Donald Trump. Joseph Biden, if he wins, is going to come into office with a raging pandemic and an economic crisis. He does not want his presidency to be about Donald Trump at all, one way or another. So I just think, whether formally or informally, the message will go out, leave this alone. It's a different story with the Manhattan District Attorney, because Cyrus Vance, who is the district attorney, first of all, he's not under the Department of Justice edict that you can't prosecute the sitting president. Plus, he won't be the sitting president anymore anyway. And this is a serious investigation. There are a lot of people who sort of assume that Donald Trump's tax returns will contain evidence of criminal behavior, as will his financial records. I don't know that. I haven't seen his tax returns. I don't know what they show, and I don't know what his finances, whether there's any criminal conduct. But I do think if Vance thinks he can build a solid case against Trump, he'll bring it. And so that is a question that will be determined appropriately by what the evidence is. But I think the U.S. Department of Justice it will not pursue it. And frankly, I think that's the right decision.
Last question, Jeff, which several listeners asked about the new Senate intelligence report again. What's your general read on that? Is there material in there that you think had not previously been disclosed or that you hadn't come across before? Does it change your perspective or your view on things? For the paperback edition, will you want to add a coda to the book talking about that, or is it more or less a confirmation of what we knew?
I think it is. It is more or less a confirmation. It is the thing that I think is the most significant, and I think it's appropriate that it came out of the Intelligence Committee. It makes even clearer the deeply sinister role of Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort was for a period of time in the summer of 2016, was the chair of Trump's campaign. And he used that access to share information with this fellow Konstantin Kilimnik, which Mueller certainly knew about. But what the Intelligence Committee adds is that Kilimnik is properly viewed as an asset of Russian intelligence. So think about that. He is sharing polling data. Manafort is sharing polling data. Meeting with Konstantin Kilimnik, who had been his ally in Ukrainian politics, and while he is working for Donald Trump, giving information to Kilimnik about the inner workings of the Trump campaign. At the same time, the Russian government, Internet Research Agency, Russian military intelligence is actively working on behalf of the president. That's a scary and sinister situation. And Mueller, had the broad outlines there, but the idea that the Intelligence Committee could establish that that connection between Manafort, Kilimnik, Russian intelligence, that's a scary business, and makes the whole story even more sinister.
Jeff, there are more questions, all of which are of interest. That's what to be expected when you have 230 excited Harvard Bookstore participants. But I want to, mindful of your time, you've been working hard. You're going to be working hard the next few days. You worked hard to produce this book, and your reporting hasn't stopped. So I want to thank you for this extraordinary book. I want to encourage everybody out there to buy it. I want to encourage you to support the Harvard Bookstore proximately in Cambridge, Massachusetts, if you can, and remotely if you're able, by donations and or most importantly by the buying of books. And I want to thank the bookstore for putting together this great event, and Jeff for once again writing an amazing book. Thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Noah, and thank you to Harvard Bookstore, which I love dearly.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation. It was so interesting. And thank you both for your really kind words about the bookstore. I can tell you that every bookseller there really appreciates it. And thank you to everyone out there for sharing your evening with us. You can learn more about and purchase Jeff's book at harvard.com or via the chat link. Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I hope everyone has a great night. Keep reading, be well, and wear a mask. Thanks so much.